video, we're going to talk about the properties of real numbers. So when we talk about real numbers, I'm talking about any number that has a decimal representation. A real number is always going to have a decimal representation. Now, that number may be able to be written as a fraction. In that case, we call it a rational real number. But if the number can't be written as a fraction, we call it irrational. So if we take the set of all rational numbers and the set of all irrational numbers and put them together, we'll have the real numbers. So our first property is going to be the associative property. And when you think of associative, I want you to think of the word grouping. Associative means that the way that we group objects together doesn't matter. When we do addition, we can write the associative property as this, where we group A and B together. And that would be the same thing as if we took those same three elements and grouped B and C together. So no matter which way you group three objects, the associative property says you'll get the same thing at the end. And you can also do this with multiplication. You can multiply two things together and then a third, and that'll be the same thing as grouping the last two objects together. So the way you group things does not matter in the associative property. When we talk about commutative property, when we think of commutative, I want you to think of the word order. So the order in which we add things doesn't matter. So I can take two real numbers, A and B, and I can add them and get the same thing as if I added B plus A. It may be in the reverse order, but the commutative property says that those two things would still be equal at the end. Note that this only works for addition and multiplication. So if we multiply two objects, the order doesn't matter. But if we do subtraction or division, the commutative property no longer applies. So if we did A minus B, that wouldn't necessarily be the same thing as B minus A. So the order doesn't matter in addition and multiplication, but when we're doing subtraction or division, the commutative property does not apply. Okay, so the next property is going to be called the distributive property. The distributive property says that we can distribute something on the left side and multiply it by everything on the inside. So we would first multiply A by B to get AB, and then we would multiply A by C on the inside to get AC. This is called left distribution. Left distribution works and right distribution works. Right distribution would be something like A plus B, but then I would have C on the outside. So we would multiply what's on the inside by what's on the outside. You would get AC plus BC. And since C is on the right side, this is called right distribution. So there is left and right types of distribution. The next property is going to be the additive identity. This means that you can add 0 to anything and still get the same thing back. It doesn't matter what you add to 0, you'll always get that element back. 0 is what's called the additive identity, because it always gives you back the same thing when you add. There is an additive identity, but there's also a multiplicative identity. So what number can you multiply anything by and get the same thing back? That number would be 1. So A times 1 would just be A. 1 times B, that would just be B. So we call 1 the multiplicative identity. The multiplicative identity. And once again, The identity is just an element that when you add it or multiply it to something, you get the same thing that you started off with back. It doesn't change anything. Now let's talk about inverses. The additive inverse is going to be what you add to something to get the additive identity 0. So for example, if I add 3 and negative 3, I'll get 0. So we say that negative 3 is the additive inverse of the positive 3. So this is the additive inverse of positive 3. And vice versa. We can say that this positive 3 is the additive inverse of negative 3. There's also what's called a multiplicative inverse. That means that we can multiply a number by something to get the multiplicative identity back. In this case, if we multiply a by the fraction 1 over a, we'll get 1 because the a's cancel out at the end. So for example, if I have the number 3, I can multiply it by 1/3 to get back to 1 because the 3 at the top and the 3 in the denominator are going to cancel out. The last thing that I want to talk about is the zero product property. This means that if you take a times b and you get 0, then either a is 0, b is 0, or they're both 0. So a could be 0, b could be 0, or a equals 0 and b equals 0. And that's called the zero product property. We can multiply anything by 0 to get to 0. So those are the properties of real numbers.